name's Joseph Hillstrom King, and I was, my parents fell in love in the 60s, and the soundtrack of the relationship was Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and the folk rock of the time. So I was named after the Joan Baez song, I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night. My dad is not, contrary to what you would think, he's not a scary guy. My dad is the voice of calm and reason. He's a very reassuring figure. My parents are both pretty successful writers, and I thought that if I wrote under my own name, there'd be the temptation to publish work that was not so good, just to make use of that last name. Whereas if I wrote as Joe Hill and no one knew who I was, there'd be an opportunity to rise or fall on my own merits. I wrote 4 novels I was never able to publish, including one I spent 3 years on. It was about 900 pages long, and I worked on it. Finally, I sent it out, and I got turned down in America, in Canada, and England, big press, small press. It's kind of a heartbreaker, but in looking back, I feel that was a case of the pen name doing its job. That if the book wasn't good enough to sell on its own terms, then I'm glad that it didn't sell, because you don't want to come out with a mediocre book. What gets me started, what gets me excited, is a good concept, an interesting and unique concept. And once I have a concept that feels fresh to me, I can write on that for about 3 days. And then after 3 days, I need a character. I need a person who has a real and interesting inner life, who has a sense of mystery about them, a character who is worth exploring for 30 pages or 300 pages, whether it's a short story or a novel. And if I can't find that character, if I can't lock into a character I care about, that story will never be finished. It'll die somewhere on the 4th or 5th day and go in the bottom drawer. I had these novels I couldn't sell that were all too long, and I felt that I needed to get small and I needed to learn economy. So when I had this baseball story that was 140 pages long, I looked at it and thought, it's too short to be a novel, and it's too long to be a short story. I have to do something with it. I'm going to try to cut it down. And I began to cut it, and it was almost like one of these games you play when you're a college student to see how many kids you could fit into a car or a phone booth. It became fun to see how short I could make it. And I did write several strange ghost stories and stories of the fantastic, which were published in little fringe magazines, and eventually were collected into this book, 20th Century Ghosts. For me, when I'm working on a story, I really have to have that character I'm excited about. And certainly with Heart-Shaped Box, Jude took off for me almost from the first paragraph. I was really interested to know who he really was. And part of the fun of writing about him was he was such a survivor, he was so resilient. It became sort of a game to see there must be some way to wipe him out, and so I just kept laying on, making things worse and worse, figuring sooner or later he'd crack. And the worse things got, the more resourceful he became. I've been asked a few times if I modeled Jude on any one particular rock star. There are certainly guys who have had his kind of career. 2 New England natives who come to mind are Steven Tyler and Joe Perry, who've had the drug addictions and the big hit singles and the videos, and it seems like Aerosmith should just dry up and blow away. But instead, every few years they reinvent themselves and they're huge all over again. And Jude has had that kind of career, but I'd say the difference between, say, Jude and someone like Steven Tyler is Jude is really driven by anger. There's a mix that's still on my computer of about 15 songs that I listened to relentlessly when I was working on that book. And of course, the Nirvana song, Heart-Shaped Box, was one of them. Originally, Heart-Shaped Box was called Private Collection. And what happened was Jude buys this haunted suit online, and UPS brings it a few days later. And when I was writing the scene when UPS delivers the package, I was listening to iTunes, and Heart-Shaped Box came up on random. And I thought, oh, this is great, I'll stick the suit in a heart-shaped box. And 3 months later, that was the title of the book. I once heard that there are 2 kinds of writers. There's writers who write about what they know, and they share their knowledge with the reader. And then there are writers who just make crap up. And I seem to fall into the second category. I think that's you really almost have to take a punch in, punch out attitude to it. That it's got to be like any other job. You know, the one characteristic of writers who wait for inspiration to strike is that usually they die still waiting, with nothing published. You know, you wanna crank away. You know, bad days, good days. You just want to keep working because you want to be, when inspiration does come. You know, you want to have, you know, the typewriter already turned on. When I was growing up, my parents had home offices, and I'd come home, they'd always be home working in the office. It seemed very eccentric and strange. And now I think it's very common for kids to come home from school and find their parents sitting in the office at home working away on the computer. I wasn't, even as a kid, I wasn't really scared by horror movies. What I remember as being scary was, I remember when I was a little guy, I remember the hostages in Iran. And every time there was a news story about the hostages in Iran, I'd hide under the dining room table. I was just so upset by the whole thought of it, you know, that those people were going to die. And, you know, and it was always, the real world was always, people wonder why do people want to read scary stories? But the reason they read scary stories is because it's a safe, entertaining way to sort of condition yourself for the shocks of real life. You know, horror stories have nothing on real life. Horror stories are a blast and a total escape for many people. I did think for a time that I would go into the film business. When I was in college, I had all these Orson Welles dreams. But I worked in the film business for a little bit. It's still very much a regional business. It's becoming less of a regional business with every passing year. But I just didn't want to live in LA. I liked everything else about the business well enough. I thought I could get on in it. But I just didn't like the inversion and, you know, the weird, sprawling, endless flat suburbs and the strip malls. And New England, you know, New England is where I grew up. You know, small town Maine. It was you know, where I spent my childhood. And New England's a very literary climate. You really can't, you know, you can't throw a stick in Boston without it bouncing off the head of Howard Zinn and two other writers. You know, and I like that it's a literary climate, a thoughtful climate. I like that it has seasons. I'll tell you about New England. I'll tell you what the best thing about New England is. If you get stuck in a snowbank, by the time you get out of the car, there's 4 people pushing. Where do they come from? They're just all of a sudden there's 4 people helping you out of the snowbank. And you know, every state is great. I'm sure, you know, I'm sure there's the same kind of, you know, attitude in other states and everything. But New England is what I know about it. And I've always found that sort of a special part of the New England's character.